A river moves, and a civilization can vanish. For the people of the ancient world, a river wasn't just part of the landscape. It was the foundation, the whole story of early empires. It's a story of flowing water. It's about how a river system shifts, and that shift determines everything. It decides which kingdom rises and which one falls. So you have these mighty kingdoms toppled by forces in the environment, forces that were invisible to them. And the question is, how does that happen? How does a river, something that seems so permanent, become an instrument of collapse? And these ancient events, these dramas with water, they hold warnings. Warnings that are hidden but are meant for us for today. When you imagine a lost city, what do you picture bringing it down? The first farmers settling by the river, they weren't just picking a spot for the scenery. It was a deeper kind of bet. They'd watch the flood come and then recede, and what it left behind was this dark, damp mud, different from any other soil. Soft, fertile, it promised so much. That was the river's gift, this yearly deposit of silt, rich with nutrients, and that changed everything. A family could grow more than they needed just to get by. That surplus, that's the spark. It's what you have to have before anything else, before civilization, because with that reliable extra food, not everyone has to farm. Some can make pottery, weave cloth, work metal, become priests. Others can be soldiers or administrators. A social structure starts to form, right there on the floodplain, built on that bounty. And that relationship created a powerful idea. Historians call it the hydraulic civilization. Carl Wittfogel argued this in Dry Places, managing large-scale irrigation, building canals and dikes. It required huge, coordinated effort. And that effort, he said, leads naturally to a centralized power, an authoritarian one, a bureaucracy for water. So the king, the pharaoh, they were first the master of the flood. Their political authority came from claiming to control that vital resource. Now, scholars today would say the theory is too rigid. It doesn't fit every case perfectly. But the core idea still holds. It shows how the structure of these early states, their power, their social order, it was all woven from the same material as the river mud. The river demanded large-scale cooperation, and that cooperation built empires. So the river wasn't a neighbor. It was the foundation, the engine, the architect. It gave the water for crops, the silt for fertility, the routes for trade and communication. Its predictable rhythms set the calendar. Its floods inspired gods and myths. It was a powerful symbiosis, beautiful, even, but there was a catch, a terrifying one. The whole magnificent structure, the temples, the armies, the granaries full of surplus, all of it rested on one assumption. That the river would behave, that its path was fixed, its floods were manageable, its gifts were eternal, and that assumption, that was the gamble with the highest possible stakes. The ground they built on wasn't solid. A river isn't just a line, it's a living system, always working, always carving the land. To see how an empire falls, you have to see that. A river always looks for the easiest path, and that path never stays the same. Think about the great flat plains, built by thousands of years of silt. That's where the first civilization started. To people, it looked like a stable, fertile place. But in geological terms, it's a shifting canvas. The river there isn't trapped in its bed. It's more like an artist, and the sediment is its material. Over time, the river starts to bend. It curves into loops, cutting away at the outer bank and dropping silt on the inner one. Those loops get bigger and bigger. Sometimes a loop gets cut off completely, leaving a crescent-shaped lake. The river just redrew its own map a little. But there's a bigger change possible, a catastrophic one. It's called an avulsion. That's when a river, choked with sediment, just leaves its main channel in a huge flood. It breaks through its banks and cuts a whole new course across the plain. In days or weeks, the region's lifeline can move miles away. The old channel is left behind, a dry scar. What makes it so unstable? A few relentless forces. The sediment load, how much dirt the river carries. The gradient, how steep the plain is. Even the slow movement of tectonic plates, tilting the land over centuries, pushing the water somewhere new. These weren't single events. They were the constant background processes of the planet, operating on a timescale much longer than a human life, but still able to deliver a civilization-ending shock within a few generations. That's the haunting part. The river's inherent instability was the unseen architect. Ancient engineers were brilliant. They built canals and levees and dams. They managed the river's whims. They handled the annual floods. But they could never control the foundational geology their whole world was built on. They were building palaces and temples and cities on a canvas that was literally moving under their feet. And that brings us to the first kingdom, the one that learned this lesson the hardest way. The Indus Valley Civilization. It was a gamble, and it left behind these silent cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa. They were laid out in grids with drainage systems running right under the streets. A society that had mastered its environment, or it seemed that way. Then, around 1900 BC, something shifted. The cities weren't destroyed. There was no invasion, no fire. They were just let go. People left. The streets went quiet. For a long time, that was the puzzle. Why leave? Why abandon something so sophisticated? The answer wasn't really in the ruins. It was in the ground around them. If you look at a map now, you see this arid region between the Indus and the Ganges. The Thar Desert, but if you look deeper, with satellites, with core samples, a different story is there. Under the sand, there are these ghostly traces. Paleo channels, a massive river system, the Ghaggar-Hakra, a river that once flowed, that many think was the Sarasvati from the old texts. That was likely the lifeblood for the eastern settlements. Its water fed the farms that fed the cities, and then the river began to fail. The cause was a slow shift in the climate. The monsoons, the rains that fed the river's headwaters, they started tracking east. At the same time, tectonic activity might have uplifted the land, changed the slope. The Ghaggar-Hakra didn't vanish overnight. It starved over generations. From a mighty flow to a seasonal stream, and then to a memory under the desert. You have to imagine that pressure. A bad harvest one year, then a few more. The water table drops, canals go dry. The agricultural surplus, what fed the priests, the artisans, it starts to dwindle. Social contracts, they were built on abundance. Under scarcity, they begin to fray. There was no single catastrophe. It was a relentless squeeze, incremental. The river's fate was becoming their own. So they made a choice, a slow migration toward the promise of water. They moved east, following the retreating rains, toward the tributaries of the Ganges. They took their knowledge, their culture with them. The civilization, as a unified urban thing, it faded, but the people adapted. Their legacy flowed into whatever came next. This collapse, it wasn't sudden violence. It was a foundation quietly washing away. A society's greatest strength, that deep bond with a river, it became the vulnerability. The Indus Valley showed one kind of river failure, a quiet one, but there's another kind, slower, more like a poison. You find it where cities began, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Mesopotamia, those plains baked by the sun, that's where urban life was first tried. Uruk, Lagash, they didn't just wait for floods, they controlled them. They built canals, huge networks, they turned dry land into something green. It was a peak of engineering, but the river had another lesson, a hidden one. About consequences they didn't see. Irrigation was their triumph, but inside it was a seed of decline. The climate was hot, dry. Water brought to the fields would evaporate. And when it evaporated, it left behind what it had carried: salt, tiny amounts over years, over centuries. It built up in the soil, a slow accumulation. Invisible, you wouldn't see it in one season, but you'd taste it in the harvests that started to fail. We know this because they wrote it down. Clay tablets from their show a change. Early records talk about wheat, good yields, then the yields fall, and then the records shift. They stop mentioning wheat, they start recording barley. Barley is tougher, it can handle saltier ground. That's a written record, a crisis unfolding over generations. The land was turning toxic from the same water that made it fertile. And there was another threat from the river, the Euphrates. On a flat plain, a river isn't fixed, its course can move. A major shift in its channel could be a disaster. Imagine a port, a trade hub, then the main river channel silts up or moves away, the docks are left dry, the flow of goods stops, communication stops. Wealth stops, the city is isolated, its heart cut off. Now put these two things together. The soil produces less food, that strains everything, the social order. And the map of the water is changing. Some cities lose their connection, others might gain. What does that lead to? Conflict, fighting over what's left. Over the fertile land that's dwindling, over the stable water channels. Later Mesopotamian history is a record of fragmentation, smaller city-states. Constant war for dominance. It wasn't just ambitious kings, it was likely driven by something deeper: scarcity, the environment. The river system that let civilization bloom was now undermining it. Breaking its unity, the cradle of civilization showed that no society, no matter how brilliant at the start, was safe from the long conversation with its environment. The rivers gave them a world, and then, through slow chemistry and shifting paths, they began to take it back. The Nile was supposed to be the exception. The reliable one. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable. The Indus could just disappear, but the Nile was this model of consistency. Its flood came every year like clockwork from the summer rains down south. It would swell up and spread that silt, that life, across the strip of land that was Egypt, and that predictability built something. It built the Old Kingdom. The Pyramid Age, the pharaohs who were gods on earth, their power was absolute, and it flowed as steady as the river. They built those tombs, those eternal pyramids, not just with stone, but with this total confidence. Confidence that the Nile would never fail. Their whole society was a reflection of that perfect, rhythmic gift. The pharaoh's most sacred job was to guarantee the flood through ritual. The river's consistency was the foundation for their theology, their politics, their entire world. Then, around 2200 BCE, that foundation cracked. The first evidence isn't from Egyptian records. It's from ice cores drilled from glaciers in distant mountains. The layers there tell a global climate story. And then from sediment down in the Nile Delta, another record, and together they point to a long drought, a devastating one. The rains that fed the Nile's sources down in equatorial Africa, they faltered. Maybe for decades, the Great Flood didn't just come low one year. It failed, year after year after year. You can see the echoes of this in the few texts that survive from the end of that era. They describe a country in distress. The river is empty, they say. The land is ruined, grain is scarce, people are hungry, and the social order unraveled. Provincial governors, once loyal to the pharaoh at Memphis, started acting like kings themselves, hoarding what little food there was. The central authority, that god-king who promised abundance, couldn't deliver anymore. Couldn't deliver that most basic promise. The theological contract was broken. If the pharaoh was a god who ensured the flood, and the flood didn't come, then what was he? This was a different kind of collapse. The Nile didn't change course, it didn't poison the land, it just diminished. The volume of life it carried fell below some critical line. And that was enough. The big building project stopped. The unified kingdom splintered into competing regions. A dark age set in. a period of famine and political chaos. Historians would call it the first intermediate period. Here, the river's failure was one of absence, not betrayal, and it revealed this terrifying vulnerability. That even the most benevolent, predictable river is ultimately a gift from a climate system much, much larger than any civilization. And when that larger system hiccuped, when the rains failed far away, the most stable society in the ancient world found that its entire identity was built on a premise that could quite literally just dry up. The pharaoh's power wasn't just political, it was hydrological. And when the water stopped, so did the kingdom. The Nile had its rhythm. That was a gift. Not every river gave that. Some rivers were partners, others were more demanding. They built civilizations through necessity, a brutal kind of necessity. China's Huang He is the example. The Yellow River, they call it China's sorrow. That name tells you something. For thousands of years it flooded, it changed course, it brought hardship, profound hardship, yet that same force was the catalyst. For Chinese civilization, the early dynasties, the Shang, the Zhou, their story is a struggle with this river. The river carries silt, fine, yellow silt. That's where the name comes from. That silt is fertile, but it also raises the riverbed. In the lower reaches, the river flows high, higher than the plain. Held back by dikes, human-made dikes, it's a suspended threat. To farm that valley was to live under it, and that created an imperative, a social imperative. Survival required coordination, a scale of coordination beyond any single village, beyond any local lord. You needed networks, dikes, canals, dredging. That required a labor force, a massive, organized labor force. It demanded planners, engineers, overseers. It demanded a state, a centralized, bureaucratic state. This wasn't philosophy, it was practical, born from the mud. The river's chaos forged the authority needed to contain it. The early Chinese state was in part a flood control agency. But that relationship created a loop, a feedback loop between nature and politics. The health of the dynasty was linked to the river. A well-maintained dike system meant control. Stability, abundant harvests, that was seen as virtuous rule. The dynasty held the mandate of heaven, but when a ruling house grew weak or corrupt or distracted, the maintenance would falter, silt would clog the channels, dikes would decay, and then the river would break free. A major avulsion could drown regions, wipe out harvests, cause famine for millions, and in the eyes of the people, this was no accident. A catastrophic flood was a sign, a clear sign that the dynasty had lost heaven's favor. The mandate was withdrawn. The river's wrath was the political verdict. It fueled revolts. It empowered warlords. It justified overthrow. The river was an agent of political change. So the Nile's failure was a shock to a stable system. The Yellow River was woven into the system. Its destructive power was the engine of the dynastic cycle. To rule China was to tame the river, and to fail at that was to lose everything. It wasn't just the rivers setting the terms, it was the human response. The fight back, these civilizations faced with an unpredictable foundation, they didn't just accept it, they started to engineer their world. They began a conversation with the water. And that conversation demanded incredible ingenuity and organization. In the Persian deserts, where surface rivers were scarce, they developed the Kanat, a gently sloping underground tunnel, dug back into the foothills to tap a water table. It brings groundwater to the surface by gravity, no pumps, the scale is humbling. These tunnels could run for miles. They dug vertical shafts every 100 feet or so for construction and for air. It was a monumental, hidden architecture. A society betting its survival on understanding the hidden geometry of the earth. It let cities flourish in the starkest landscapes, a testament to reading the environment in a deeper way. Then far to the east, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire built a different kind of water machine. At Angkor, they didn't just have a river. They engineered an entire hydrological landscape, vast reservoirs called barrays, some stretched over 5 miles long, capturing the monsoon rains. A complex network of canals and moats distributed this water. It turned the region into a powerhouse of rice agriculture. This system didn't just feed a city, it fed an empire, and it supported the spiritual vision of god-kings. Temples like Angkor Wat rose from this managed aquatic world. It was a total integration: water, food, power, and belief. And then there were the Nabateans. In their rose-red city of Petra, in a desert wadi, they mastered the flash flood. They carved channels into the cliff sides, built dams and diversion walls, created an intricate system of cisterns and pipes. They didn't fight the occasional torrent. They captured it, tamed it, stored it for the long dry periods. Their survival in that beautiful, harsh place was a masterpiece of precise hydraulic control. These were profound expressions of societal will. To build them required more than engineering skill. It required a political authority that could mobilize thousands of workers for years. It required planners who could think in decades, not seasons. This was technology born from absolute necessity. A declaration that humans could shape the very terms of their existence. But this raises a haunting question. Did these brilliant innovations backfire? Could the very systems designed to create stability plant the seeds of a later collapse? Consider that immense canal network in Mesopotamia again. It brought life. But by constantly bringing river water to the fields, letting it evaporate, it accelerated the salinization of the soil. Their solution to one problem slowly created a worse one. Or a massive dam, a reservoir. It traps silt, the fertile sediment that should replenish the land downstream. Over centuries that can starve the delta. Make the land less productive. The engineering triumph of one generation could be an ecological debt for the next. This is the constant tug of war between human control and natural force. Every dam, every canal, every tunnel is an attempt to impose order on a system that is, by its nature, dynamic, shifting. The ancient engineers were the first to play this high-stakes game. They bought their civilization's time, sometimes centuries of it, but their stories suggest no design is permanent, because the river, the climate, the land itself, they are always writing the next chapter. And sometimes the most sophisticated water management creates a fragile dependency, a civilization living on borrowed time, inside a masterpiece of its own making. A river's story is never just local. Its flow is a final message. It carries news from far away, from the sky itself. To understand a civilization's fate, you have to look up. To the patterns that decide where rain falls, where snow gathers. The true throttle on any river system is held by the climate, by these vast, slow-moving atmospheric rhythms that operate across continents and oceans. Think of the monsoon, that seasonal reversal of winds that brings the rain to places like India and Southeast Asia. Its strength, its timing, they aren't constant. They're influenced by distant sea temperatures, by things like the El Niño Southern Oscillation. A shift there can mean the difference between a bountiful flood and a devastating drought. Not for one valley, but for an entire subcontinent. Or the westerly winds that sweep across the North Atlantic. Their oscillation can steer storms north toward Europe or south toward the Mediterranean, deciding which river basins get the winter snows to feed them through a dry summer. These are planetary-scale regulators, and when they shift, even slightly, they send a shockwave down every river that depends on them. Which brings us to a moment, around 2200 BCE, when these regulators seem to have faltered across much of the world. Geologists and climatologists see the signature. In ice cores, in lake sediments, in stalagmites from caves. They call it the 4.2 Kiloyear event, a period of abrupt aridification that lasted, in some regions, for centuries. The impact was simultaneous and catastrophic. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire collapsed, history's first great multi-ethnic empire. Ancient texts describe dust storms so severe they darken the sky. A famine so deep people sold their children for food. The Tigris and Euphrates, starved of reliable rain and snowmelt from their headwaters, could no longer sustain the agricultural surplus the empire was built on. The central power in Akkad just evaporated as its provinces fought over dwindling resources. At the very same time, the Nile's floods failed, plunging Egypt into the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. And in the Indus Valley, the monsoons that fed the Ghaggar-Hakra river system began their long retreat eastward, starting that slow-motion abandonment of the great cities. It's a staggering realization. 3 foundational cradles of civilization, separated by vast deserts and mountains, all entering a period of profound crisis within a few generations of each other. This wasn't a coincidence of bad local luck. It was a global climate event turning the dials on all their river systems at once. The lesson is profound. These civilizations didn't merely rise and fall according to the whims of their local geography. They thrived during what we now see were unusually stable and benevolent climatic periods. Their golden ages were, in a real sense, a gift of good weather, a long, quiet chapter in the Earth's turbulent climate story. But when that chapter ended, when the climate system entered a period of rapid change, their resilience was tested on a scale they couldn't have conceived. The challenge was no longer just a river changing course or silting up a harbor. It was the entire atmospheric engine that fed every river becoming erratic. Unpredictable, hostile, their sophisticated adaptations, their canals, their granaries, their social contracts, were designed for a range of variability they understood. They weren't prepared for the rules of the game to be rewritten from above, so the river's instability was the immediate cause of collapse, but the climate was the hand that turned that instability into a weapon. It revealed the ultimate vulnerability. These early empires had learned to read the river's moods, but they were living in a world where the sky itself could change its mind. Some civilizations pushed this control to the absolute limit. They weren't just managing a river, they tried to build a new one. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire built a water machine on a staggering scale. At its center was Angkor. At its peak, around the year 1200, it might have been the largest pre-industrial city in the world, and its survival in that place, with its intense wet and dry seasons, was an engineering miracle. A miracle built entirely on water. The Khmer didn't have a reliable river like the Nile. They had the monsoon, months of heavy rain, then months of near drought. Their solution was to capture the flood and stretch it through the dry time. They sculpted the land. They built a vast hydraulic network. Enormous reservoirs called barrays, some over 5 miles long, acted as artificial lakes. A web of canals distributed that stored water. Every major temple, like Angkor Wat, had a wide moat, and that moat wasn't just decoration. It was a critical part of the system, regulating water, reflecting cosmic order. This was more than infrastructure. It was theology made real. The god-kings proved their divine right by commanding the waters of life. The system fed a huge population. It supported intensive rice agriculture, sometimes 3 crops a year. It was the engine of imperial power, and for centuries it worked. But recently, a new technology let us see this system with impossible clarity. LiDAR, laser pulses from aircraft piercing the jungle canopy, mapping the ground below. The images are breathtaking. They show a landscape completely transformed. Canals, roads, smaller temples, intricate grids of field embankments, all laid out with a precision that speaks of total central control. Angkor wasn't a city in the jungle. It was a city of water, with the jungle growing over it later. But this discovery comes with a troubling insight. The very complexity that sustained Angkor may have held the seeds of its collapse. By the 15th century, the great city was largely abandoned. Kings moved the capital. The jungle reclaimed the stones. The old explanations pointed to invasion or religious change. But the water evidence suggests something deeper. The system was magnificent but fragile. It needed constant, meticulous care. Canals had to be dredged to prevent silt. The massive barrages needed their banks reinforced. The whole network was a delicate balance. And then climate data from tree rings tells a new story. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the monsoon became erratic. Not just dry, but swinging between severe droughts and catastrophic floods. That would have been a disaster for Angkor's rigid system. A long drought would lower the reservoirs, cripple agriculture. Then a sudden flood would overwhelm the canals, washing silt into the system, destroying the careful gradients. It's a theory of cascading failure. The climate shock overwhelmed their ability to maintain it. The siltation reduced the system's efficiency, which reduced the agricultural surplus, which weakened the central authority needed to organize the repairs. A vicious cycle. The infrastructure that let them defy the natural seasons made them hyper-vulnerable when those seasons became extreme. They traded resilience for maximum output. They built a masterpiece of control, but when the environment refused to be controlled, the masterpiece became a trap. Angkor's story is a warning. It shows that the most brilliant human systems are still subject to the older, wilder rhythms of the earth. Collapse wasn't the only outcome. The record shows a range. Some societies, when the river changed, they disappeared. Others, they bent, they adapted. They found a way to keep going. So what decided that between extinction and transformation? It comes down to resilience, a society's capacity to absorb a shock without breaking. A few key factors decided this. First, diversification. A civilization that depended on one river-fed crop that was a house of cards. The harvest fails, everything falls. But societies with multiple food sources, herding, fishing, gathering, trade for different grains, they had a buffer. A bad year for wheat might be offset by barley. Or by livestock. It wasn't just about calories, it was about options. The second factor was flexibility in settlement. Were people tied to one sacred city, one fixed capital? Or could they move, follow the water, shift their centers as the landscape changed? A rigid attachment to place could be a death sentence when that place lost its lifeblood. Third was the strength of trade networks. Could a society import what it could no longer produce? A robust network of exchange, reaching beyond the failing valley, could bring in food, timber, ideas. An external lifeline during a crisis. And finally, maybe most crucial, was the adaptability of political institutions. Was power so centralized that the failure of the king meant the failure of the state? Or were there local structures, community-level organizations that could take over when the central authority crumbled? You see the contrast in two stories. The cities of the Indus Valley, for all their sophistication, they seem to have been abandoned. Their urban template, their writing, their specific cultural package, it faded when the river did. They adapted by leaving, by dispersing into smaller, more mobile communities. Their legacy flowed into new cultural streams. It was a transformation so complete it looks like an end. Then consider Egypt. When the Nile failed and the old kingdom collapsed, it was a political and social catastrophe, but it wasn't a cultural extinction. The underlying agricultural template, the knowledge of how to farm the floodplain, it remained. The idea of Egypt, of the two lands unified under a pharaoh, persisted even in the chaos. Local rulers held power, but they still saw themselves as part of that Egyptian world. So when the climate stabilized and the floods returned, reunification was possible. The Middle Kingdom rose, not as a brand new civilization, but as a revival of the old one. The framework had bent, but it hadn't broken. That's the subtle lesson in the silt and stone. The capacity to adapt to environmental stress was often the thin line between transformation and extinction. It raises a question. In our own globally connected, advanced world, what does this ancient resilience look like now? Are our systems diversified, or are they perilously centralized? Are our institutions flexible or brittle? the riverbanks of history suggest survival is less about building a perfect, unchanging system, and more about cultivating the ability to change course when the current shifts. The evidence is in the dirt, in the lines you can't see on the ground. To prove a river moved, you need tools the old engineers never had. The first clue comes from above. From satellites, NASA Landsat instruments, they don't just take pictures, they see light we can't. They pick up differences in soil moisture, in how plants are growing. And from that data, an image can form, a faint, winding scar across a desert now or farmland, a paleo channel, the buried path of a river that stopped flowing thousands of years ago. It's a map of what's missing, a signature of water that's gone, seen from space. But to get the details, you have to go into the ground. They use coring. Drive a hollow tube down and pull up a cylinder of history. That core is a timeline. You see the layers, a thick band of fine, dark silt. That's a river floodplain, a time of plenty. Then a shift, the silt gives way to coarse, wind-blown sand. That's the desert coming back. The river has left. Each layer is a page. It tells you when the river was there and when it wasn't. It records droughts, floods, and the final moment the water stopped for good. The work gets more precise. Scientists analyze tiny fossils, snail shells. Ancient plant remains from a settlement. They look at oxygen isotopes inside them. Isotopes are different versions of an element with slightly different weights. The ratio in a snail's shell reflects the water it lived in. A stable river system leaves one signature. A fluctuating, dying river or a switch to a well leaves another. It's a chemical fingerprint of stress. A single grain of pollen from an old crop can tell you if the field was irrigated with river water or struggling with salty groundwater. This is how the theory becomes fact. It's not speculation about a society's decline. It's physical proof the world changed around them. You can match the layer of sand in the core to the time a city's granaries were emptied. Link the chemical stress in the shells to a layer of ash from a city that burned and wasn't rebuilt. The landscape becomes an archive. Each clue, the satellite's ghost river, the sand in the core, the whisper in a shell, they fit. It lets you reconstruct not just a political history, but an environmental biography. You can see the river's path shift, year by year, century by century, and watch the civilization built on it make its difficult choices. That's the search, reading the Earth's own history book, written in mud and stone, to understand the forces that wrote ours. The data from the core samples gives one story. A scientific one, but the people who were there, they had their own stories, they had myths, and these weren't just for entertainment. This was how the ancient world processed trauma. How it held onto hope. When a river is everything to your survival, its whims become the actions of gods. A failure is divine displeasure. A gift is a sacred blessing. These myths are a kind of cultural memory, a memory of the environment itself. There's the story from Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by a god. He's told to build a great boat. A terrible flood is coming to wipe out humanity, so he loads it, his family, the animals. The storm rages for days. It drowns the world. And then the boat comes to rest on a mountain. He sends out birds to find land. It's a story of catastrophic survival. For a civilization built between two unpredictable rivers, a major avulsion would feel like the world ending. So this myth makes sense. It's a container, a narrative container for the collective trauma of a flood. It takes a terrifying natural event and turns it into a tale. A tale with a moral, a warning, and a survivor. In China, the foundational myth is different. It's not about surviving a flood. It's about mastering one. The story of Yu the Great. Before Yu, the legendary emperors tried to control the Yellow River. They built dikes, they failed, the waters broke through. Caused immense hardship. Then Yu took a new approach. He didn't just block the water, he dredged channels, he cleared obstructions. For 13 years he labored. Directing the floodwaters to the sea, he succeeded where others failed, and he was rewarded with the mandate of heaven, founding the Xia dynasty. This isn't just a hero tale. It's a cultural blueprint for how to engage with the Yellow River. It encodes a lesson, a hard-won lesson. You cannot simply wall this river in. You have to work with its flow. Guide it, sacrifice for it. Use story, legitimize the hydraulic projects. The state-organized projects that would define Chinese civilization for millennia. It turned engineering into virtue. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the relationship was different. It was one of grateful dependency. Their hymns are to Happy, the god of the Nile flood. Their songs of abundance. Happy is shown with heavy breasts, a belly, symbols of fertility, nourishment. The hymns describe him bringing the inundation. The flood that makes the people live. There's no battle here, no epic struggle. The Nile's rhythm was so reliable it inspired a mythology of gift-giving. Benevolent, cyclical. The pharaoh's ritual role was to ensure the flood. It was an act of partnership with a generous deity, so when drought came, it was a theological crisis. A sign the partnership was broken. And then there's the memory of a river lost, a haunting one. In the ancient Hindu texts, the Rig Veda, the Sarasvati River is praised. Great among the great, the most mighty among rivers, it flows from the mountains to the sea, but in later texts she's described differently, vanishing into the desert sand. She becomes a goddess of wisdom and speech, a hidden, subterranean stream. This transformation feels like an act of preservation, cultural preservation. When a real river slowly disappears, taking settlements with it, the people didn't forget. They immortalized it. They turned a geographical feature into a divine principle. The river's physical death gave birth to a spiritual legacy. What you see in all these stories is an imprint, a deep psychological imprint. The river's reality was too big. Its destructive power, its life-giving silt, its fickle path, it was too important to be mere weather. It had to be personified, given intention, given a story. These myths were the framework through which generations understood their world, their place in it. They provided meaning in the face of chaos. They offered rituals, a sense of control over the uncontrollable. When we read these legends now, we're not just reading fiction, we're reading a people's environmental biography. Written in the language of gods and heroes, the river's dynamics were woven into their identity, so the next time you hear an old flood myth, listen closely. You might not be hearing about a capricious god, you might be hearing an echo, the echo of a shifting river channel, or the memory of a drought that lasted a lifetime. Preserved in story for thousands of years, a river was a road, the most efficient road you could have back then. Before highways, before railroads, you had moving water. A smooth, flat surface that carried people and goods with a speed land travel couldn't touch. So these great river cities weren't just farming centers. They were ports, busy, noisy ports full of different people. Think about Mohenjo-Daro on the Indus. Boats coming down from the mountains carrying timber and minerals. Others coming up from the coast bringing shells, stones, maybe trade goods from somewhere like Mesopotamia. The docks would be piled with pottery, with cloth, with grain. The city lived on that flow, its wealth, its ideas, what it was all tied to that liquid highway. Then picture that highway closing, not suddenly but slowly. A quiet strangulation, the river that made the port starts to change. Its main channel, clogged with the same silt that fed the farms, begins to wander. It shifts over the decades, a little each year. The deep channel boats needed gets shallower, turns into a maze of sandbars and mud. The trading ships can't reach the city anymore. They have to unload farther downriver at some new settlement on the deep water. The old port's economic life slows to a trickle, then it stops. This wasn't just an idea for the Indus. You can see a possible sign in the land. Some of its big settlements, places we thought were inland, we now find sitting along the old, dead channels of the river system. They were ports on a river that's now desert. When the Ghaggar-Hakra river system failed, it didn't just take irrigation water. It cut the trade networks that linked these cities to each other and to everywhere else. A city stuck in a drying landscape, its trade routes gone, doesn't have much reason to stay a city. People might stay, but that urban, connected character fades. You see this same shifting geography changing power in Mesopotamia. Take Babylon. Its rise under Hammurabi around 1750 BC wasn't just about armies. It was about place. Babylon was on a major branch of the Euphrates, a natural crossroads for trade going north-south on the river and east-west across the plains. Control that spot, you control the wealth, but the Euphrates is restless on that flat land. Centuries later, as its channels moved, the city's direct link to the main water highway might have weakened. Other cities on better channels could challenge its economic power. The historical record shows the political center shifting north over time to cities like Ashur and Nineveh on the Tigris. That change wasn't just kings and wars. It was probably driven by the slow, constant redrawing of the region's economic map by its own rivers. A shift in a trade route could move an empire's wealth almost overnight. A city with silent docks would see its merchants leave, its artisans would have no market, its rulers would lose the tax money that paid for soldiers and temples. Meanwhile, some small village on the new river course could be transformed. Its landing becomes the new port. Warehouses go up, the market grows, it pulls in people, skill, ambition. It might grow into the next great capital, its fortune built on the silt that buried its rival. It shows you something deep about these early civilizations. Their political and economic geography wasn't fixed. It was dynamic, as fluid as the rivers. A king could build the strongest walls, raise the biggest army, but he couldn't order a river to stay in its bed. The real power was often with the current. It decided which city would be a thriving crossroads and which would become a quiet backwater. Its great docks left high and dry, monuments to a road that just moved away. The water's stability shaped the soul of the civilization. You can see it in two of the great rivers, the Nile and the Yellow River. The Nile was consistent. Its flood came from summer rains far to the south. It was predictable like a calendar. It would rise, spread its silt, and recede. That rhythm created a society with profound confidence. The Egyptian worldview was cyclical, eternal. The pharaoh was a god maintaining cosmic order, and the river's reliable return was proof of his success. Their art, their architecture, their theology all reflected this belief in a benevolent, orderly universe. Political power was centralized, but it was also divinely sanctioned. Rooted in the annual gift of the flood, their technology focused on measurement, prediction, distribution, not on constant, desperate defense. Then you cross to China. The Yellow River was a different kind of teacher. It carries the highest silt load of any major river. That silt is fertile, but it constantly raises the riverbed. It creates a suspended threat. The river flows above the plain, held back only by human-made dikes. Its floods aren't gentle replenishments, they're catastrophic breaches. This environment forged a different civilization. Survival here demanded constant, massive, coordinated intervention. It required a strong, centralized, bureaucratic state. Not as a theological ideal, but as a practical necessity. Their legendary hero was Yu the Great, who tamed the floods through dredging and channeling. Not through ritual, the Chinese political concept, the mandate of heaven, was tied directly to hydraulic control. A virtuous ruler maintained the dikes and canals. A major flood was seen as heaven's verdict, a sign the dynasty had lost its right to rule. The river's volatility was woven into the mechanism of political change. Driving the dynastic cycle, rise, decay, renewal, even their psychological landscapes diverged. Egyptian hymns praise Hapi, the god of the inundation, as a bringer of abundance. Their relationship was one of gratitude. In China, the river was called China's sorrow, a force to be battled, a demanding partner that shaped a culture of resilience, collective effort, and hardship. The river's character didn't just feed the people, it taught them how to think about power, about their place in the world, about the nature of the forces governing their lives. And then there's a third model, the Indus Valley. Its rivers were fed by the monsoon, a system tied to larger, less predictable climatic patterns. When those patterns shifted, the rivers could fade. Not with a dramatic flood, but with a slow, relentless drought. This may have fostered a different adaptation. Their cities show less evidence of monumental palaces or temples to god kings. More emphasis on civic planning, standardization, perhaps a more decentralized authority. When the water failed, their collapse wasn't a dramatic political overthrow. It was a gradual dispersal, a migration to where the water had gone, so the river wrote the script. A predictable river like the Nile could support a stable, confident, theocratic state for millennia. A volatile, demanding river like the Yellow River necessitated a powerful, interventionist state, but it also made that state's legitimacy perpetually fragile. Tied to a fight it could never permanently win, a monsoon-dependent river like the Indus might encourage flexibility and decentralization, but it also left societies more vulnerable to a climatic change beyond any human engineering. The water's behavior became the civilization's personality. Its consistency or its chaos was reflected in their gods, their governments, their deepest beliefs about how the world worked. A failing river empties the fields, but that's just the start. It sets off a chain reaction. It can shatter a society from within. The first domino is the harvest. When the water's too little or too much or just not there, the crops wither, the granaries begin to empty, and that's when the real pressure starts. A widespread food shortage triggers a cascade. The price of grain skyrockets. What was affordable becomes a luxury. This inflation hits the poorest hardest. It creates a desperate underclass, and then there are the ones who control what's left: the local governors, the wealthy landowners, the temple priests. They face a choice. Do they distribute the food to stave off hunger, or do they hoard it to protect their own power, their own families? History suggests they often chose to hoard. That's the moment trust evaporates, the social contract breaks, the unwritten agreement that the ruler provides stability and food in return for loyalty and labor. It's broken. The king, the pharaoh, who claimed a divine right to ensure the flood and the harvest, is now seen as powerless or negligent. The priests who performed the rituals for the river gods are seen as having failed. Public faith in the whole institutional framework crumbles. It crumbles like dry soil, and from that loss of faith comes unrest. It starts in the provinces, far from the capital's gaze. Hungry farmers who can't pay taxes with grain they don't have may just abandon their fields. They might flock to the cities, adding to the desperation there. Or they band together in roaming groups looking for food. Local officials, cut off from central authority and facing their own starving people, stop obeying orders. They fortify their own towns. They keep what little food they have. The unified state begins to fragment. From the edges inward, trade routes already threatened by the environmental chaos get severed completely by this internal instability. A merchant won't risk a journey through a countryside filled with desperate, roving bands. The flow of goods, the flow of ideas and communication that held the civilization together, it grinds to a halt. Now the kingdom is hollowed out, its people are divided, its economy is in ruins, its leadership is discredited. It stands there, weakened and distracted by internal strife. And this is the precise moment it becomes a target. For nomadic groups living on the arid fringes, a failing river valley isn't just a tragedy next door. It's a signal. Their own pastures may be drying up, pushing them toward richer lands, and now they see those rich lands not as a powerful, unified empire, but as a collection of vulnerable, squabbling towns. The defensive armies are stretched thin, putting down rebellions. The storehouses are empty. The organized resistance that could once repel a raid has disintegrated. What might have been a minor border skirmish in a time of strength can now become an invasion, one that topples a throne. The environmental shock creates the internal fissures, and the external force delivers the final, shattering blow. We can see this domino effect on a colossal scale in a period called the Late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, a network of empires, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the New Kingdom of Egypt, city-states across the Levant, they all fell into ruin. Within about 50 years, for a long time, historians pointed to the mysterious sea peoples as the sole cause, but newer evidence paints a more complex picture. Core samples, pollen records from the region, they indicate a period of severe, prolonged drought. This climatic shift would have strained the agricultural heartlands of every one of these kingdoms. All at the same time, the resulting famines, the economic strain, they likely triggered the internal rebellions, the abandonment of cities, the breakdown of trade that the clay tablets describe. In this universally weakened condition, the movements of displaced populations, whether called sea peoples or others, they became not the cause but the catalyst. The thing that pushed a teetering international system over the edge. It shows how a shift in the climate, acting through rivers and harvests, can send a shockwave. One that collapses not just one civilization, but an entire interconnected world. Some civilizations weren't on a great river at all. They had the opposite issue. Too much water, then almost none. In the Maya lowlands there were no Niles, no yellow rivers. The foundation there was a geological fact. The Yucatan is a slab of porous limestone. Karst topography, rain doesn't pool on the surface, it goes straight down through cracks, carving out a hidden world of caves and aquifers. On the surface, that's a problem. Where do you get water? The answer was in the sky and the ground. They learned to capture what fell. Sometimes the limestone roof over an aquifer would collapse. That made a natural well, a cenote. These deep blue pools were sacred, portals to the underworld and vital water sources, but cenotes weren't everywhere. So they paved plazas with plaster to channel rain. They built canals and dams. They constructed massive, lined reservoirs right in their cities. Tikal had huge holding tanks, millions of gallons of rainwater stored from the wet season. This was a civilization built on a calculation. Capture enough in the wet months to survive the dry ones. Their calendar, their farming, where they lived, all tuned to that rhythm. An incredible adaptation, hydrological ingenuity without a river, but it created a specific vulnerability. The system had no backup. When rains were good, reservoirs filled, city-states flourished, the classic period, towering pyramids, powerful kings. That prosperity was on a knife's edge. All it took was a shift in the rainfall, a few weaker wet seasons, longer dry ones, and the math would fail. Reservoirs wouldn't reach capacity, then they'd begin to empty. And as the water level dropped, so did everything else. We have the climate record now, sediment cores from lakes, stalagmites from caves. They show recurring drought. Severe dry periods in the 9th century, right as the classic Maya entered its decline. You can picture it. A city's main reservoir is half full at the start of the dry season. Tensions rise, rationing begins. The king, whose power is tied to providing water, watches his authority drain away. Outlying villages with smaller systems get abandoned. People retreat to the city, more pressure on the dwindling supply. Scarcity turns the landscape into a chessboard. What was a network of allies and rivals becomes a fight for the last reliable water holes. Stone inscriptions change. They used to record royal births, celestial events. Now they tell of intensified warfare, not just ritual, more desperate. Aimed at capturing rival centers, the competition for water likely drove that violence. conquer a city, you control its reservoirs, a short-term fix that deepened the instability. The collapse wasn't one event, it was a slow unraveling. City by city, the system broke down, water security vanished, faith in the institutions built around it vanished. The population dispersed, grand plazas went back to the jungle. The Maya case is a variation on the theme. The principle isn't about rivers specifically. It's about total dependence on a hydrological regime. Whether it's a predictable flood, a managed canal, or a calculated reservoir, when that regime fails, when the climate shifts and the old calculations stop working, the civilization faces a crisis it can't engineer its way out of. The Maya didn't have a shifting river, they had a shifting sky, and when the rains changed pattern, the foundation of a world dissolved. Those echoes from the river valleys, they aren't quiet. It's a conversation we're still in. The same problems that took down the granaries at they're unfolding in our own farmlands. There's the slow poisoning of the soil in Mesopotamia, that salt building up from irrigation. You see a modern reflection of that in California's Central Valley. It's one of the most productive regions in the world, and water is drawn from rivers, from aquifers, to feed crops in a climate that's semi-arid. The water evaporates just like in Sumer. It leaves the salts behind in the soil. Over decades, that's degraded millions of acres. It reduces yields. It forces farmers into expensive drainage systems, or they abandon fields. It's the same chemical story, but now it's diesel pumps and satellite imaging instead of shadows and clay tablets. Then there's the silt, that life-giving silt that built the plains in Mesopotamia and China. It had a hidden cost. In Cambodia, the canals at Angkor, they slowly filled with sediment. It reduced their capacity, it reduced their efficiency, and that same process is the central challenge for every major dam we build now. The Aswan High Dam on the Nile, the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze, they all trap the fertile sediment, the sediment that once replenished the floodplains and deltas downstream, that starves the land. It leads to erosion along the coast. It reduces the dam's own lifespan as the reservoir fills with mud. We're replicating an ancient dilemma, but we're doing it on a colossal scale. Trading immediate water control for consequences that are geological and long-term. The lesson from these stories, it isn't about primitive failure. It's about a kind of inescapable logic, the logic of large-scale environmental engineering. Any system we build to control water, it demands maintenance. Perpetual, careful maintenance. It requires a deep understanding, a localized understanding of the ecology it's operating within. The moment that maintenance is neglected, or that understanding is lost, the system begins to decay. And that decay, it's often political first, it's social long before it's physical. When the central authority in Akkad grew weak, or in Angkor, the canal dredging stopped. The dike repairs were deferred, that meticulous balance was upset, and the infrastructure designed for stability became an accelerator of collapse. This reframes how we see those early civilizations. They weren't primitive societies just at the mercy of nature. They were the first great experimenters. Experimenters in sustainable living. Their cities and fields were tests, long-term tests of human ingenuity against hydrological reality. Their successes, some of which lasted 1,000 years, they show what's possible. Possible with careful adaptation, with constant vigilance. Their failures, they aren't just historical footnotes, they're data points, crucial data on what happens. What happens when short-term thinking takes over, or institutional rigidity, or a changing climate? What happens when those things overwhelm even the most brilliant human designs? We live now in the ultimate era of hydraulic civilization. Billions of people depend on managed rivers, on aquifer withdrawals, on massive dams. The ancient lesson is clear. Our security isn't found in building a perfect, static system and then walking away. It's found in cultivating the wisdom to maintain, to adapt, to listen to the land. The river's path may have changed from mud brick to concrete, but the fundamental dialogue, the one between human ambition and the water's flow, it remains exactly the same. The ghost rivers aren't just lines in the sand anymore. We can hear them now. We have tools that listen to the earth, mapping these whispers of vanished water. Ground-penetrating radar, it sends pulses of energy down into the soil, and when those pulses hit a boundary, like the smooth, dense layer of silt in an old riverbed, they bounce back. The machine listens, it builds a picture of what's under a modern farm or a parking lot or a city. Archaeologists have used this. They've traced the precise, dry channels that once snaked past the walls of ancient cities. It shows how close that lifeblood was and where it went when it left, but it's not just about finding one lost path. It's about reconstructing entire watersheds. The ancient networks of streams and tributaries that fed a civilization. Researchers now take centuries of data and feed it into geographic information systems. That's powerful mapping software. They input clues from old texts, descriptions of landmarks that are gone now. They layer in satellite imagery, which shows these subtle depressions in the terrain. They add soil samples, pollen records. The software synthesizes all of it. It creates a dynamic, three-dimensional model of a landscape that hasn't existed for thousands of years. We can see the paleo lakes, the seasonal marshes, the main arteries and the tiny capillaries of water. That water defined where people could live and farm and build. Then the simulation starts, using computational fluid dynamics. The same kind of modeling used to design aircraft wings. Scientists can bring these ghost rivers back to life. They pour virtual water into the reconstructed channels. They can adjust the slope, the sediment load, the volume of flow. They can run the simulation for 100 years in an afternoon. What happens if the monsoon weakens by 20%? Where does the river jump its banks if a major levee fails? How does silt build up at a crucial bend, eventually choking a port? These aren't just animations, they're rigorous experiments. They let us test with mathematical precision theories about how an environmental shift would have translated into failed harvests. Abandoned trade routes, social stress. There was one profound project that applied this to the Indus Valley. By modeling the ancient Ghaggar-Hakra system and simulating the gradual eastward shift of the monsoon rains, researchers could watch the river's flow diminish. Season by virtual season, they could correlate the drying of specific branches with the abandonment timeline of settlements along them. The data showed it wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a relentless, predictable squeeze. The simulation gave a clear, visual answer to the centuries-old question of why they left. This digital resurrection changes everything. It moves the conversation from scholarly debate into the realm of evidence. A theory about a river's role in a city's fall is one thing. A color-coded simulation showing that city's agricultural hinterland turning from green to brown over 50 virtual years, driven by the fading blue line of a modeled river, that's something else entirely. It turns a historical mystery into a hydrological case study. These ghost maps are more than reconstructions. They're a new kind of time machine. They let us stand on the banks of rivers that have been dust for millennia, and finally understand the power they held over the fate of the people who depended on them. The river's flow was mirrored in the stars. For the ancient mind, the practical and the spiritual were never separate. Water was more than a resource for crops or a route for boats. It was a sacred thread woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. The layout of their greatest cities often reveals this. It wasn't just about efficiency, it was about alignment with the heavens and with the waters below. In Egypt, the Nile was seen as the earthly reflection of the Milky Way. That celestial river in the night sky. The pharaoh's journey after his passing was a voyage on these waters from the east bank of the Nile, the land of the living and the rising sun, to the west bank, the land of the eternal resting place and the setting sun. Their temples were precisely oriented, not just to the river's flow, but to the solstice sun, to specific stars. The entire landscape was a map of their universe, with the Nile as its central axis. Far to the east, the Ganges holds a similar profound place. In Hindu tradition, it is a goddess, Ganga, who descended from heaven to purify the earth. To bathe in its waters is to wash away spiritual impurities. Its course is a pilgrimage route. Cities like Varanasi are built upon its banks not merely for water, but because the river itself is a conduit to the divine. The river's physical presence is inseparable from its role as a purifier of souls, and in the Maya world, without great rivers, they found the sacred in the ground itself. Their cenotes, those natural wells in the limestone, were not just water sources. They were portals to Xibalba, the underworld. Offerings were made in these deep, dark pools. Temples were built around them. The path to the gods and ancestors was straight down through that water. This deep spiritual connection transforms a practical crisis into something far more terrifying. When a river shifts course or dries up, it isn't just an engineering problem. It's a theological earthquake. If the Nile fails to flood, it isn't just a bad harvest. It means the pharaoh has lost the favor of the gods. The cosmic order, Mot, is broken. The connection between heaven and earth is severed. Imagine the psychological impact. Your entire understanding of how the world works, your rituals, your prayers, the placement of your temples, the journey of your soul, all of it is tied to the reliable behavior of that river. When it behaves unpredictably, it doesn't just threaten your food, it threatens your meaning. It suggests the universe itself has become unstable, hostile. The gods are angry or absent. This intertwining made societies incredibly resilient during good times. It gave every act, from farming to governing, a sacred purpose. But it also made them profoundly vulnerable to change. A king could maybe explain a lost battle. He could not easily explain a river that defied the gods. The spiritual crisis would amplify the social one, shaking faith in leadership at the very moment unity was most needed. The river was the pillar holding up both their physical world and their spiritual one. And when that pillar shook, both worlds came crashing down together. Empires built monuments to last forever, but their neighbors lived differently. On the steppes, in the deserts, the land wasn't something to master. It was a pasture to be read. Their wealth walked sheep, goats, cattle, horses. When the grass grew thin in one valley, they gathered their herds and moved. Mobility was their architecture. Their greatest adaptation was the ability to leave. This created an asymmetry. In a prolonged drought, a settled civilization faced an impossible choice. Its people were bound to the land, to their irrigated fields and stone cities. They had to endure the scarcity, watch their social order crack, but for the nomad on the arid fringe, the same drought was a signal. It was time to move, and the most logical direction was often toward the failing, but still greener river valleys. What history books call a sudden invasion, a migration wave. The Hyksos entering Egypt, movements linked to the Hittite collapse, the Sea Peoples, these likely weren't random aggression. They were often a final phase, an environmental domino effect. A drought on the steppe pushes a pastoralist group toward the frontier. They find the frontier settlements weakened, garrisons underfed and rebellious. The initial contact might be trade or a raid, but as the pressure behind them grows and the fragility ahead becomes clear, that movement can become a flood. The political event, the fall of a dynasty, the sacking of a capital, that's the visible explosion. The fuel was the slow-burning crisis of water and grass. Take the Hyksos. Their takeover of northern Egypt coincided with the Second Intermediate Period. Climate data suggests a time of difficulties. While the Nile's central authority fragmented, these pastoralist settlers from the Levant arrived. They were adept at mobility, at new technologies like the chariot. They found a delta in disarray. They didn't conquer a powerful kingdom. They filled a power vacuum created by environmental and social strain. This reframes the dynamic. For centuries, the narrative cast the nomad as the destructive outsider, the barbarian at the gate. But from an ecological perspective, their fluid relationship with the land was arguably more sustainable. A better adaptation to a climate that was never truly stable. They invested in networks of kinship, in knowledge of seasonal routes, not in fixed, monumental infrastructure that could become a trap. Their entire way of life was a response to variability. The great agrarian empires made a colossal bet on stability. They banked on the river's consistency. They poured their wealth into stone and soil to maximize its gift. That bet created civilization with all its art, law, and complexity, but it also created a profound vulnerability. When the environment changed beyond the design limits of their systems, they had nowhere to go. The nomads living lightly on the land always had somewhere to go. In the long conversation between humanity and a changing planet, their story suggests something. Sometimes resilience looks less like building a mighty wall, and more like knowing when to fold your tent. Up north, where the high deserts meet the mountains, there was another civilization, the Oxus civilization. Archaeologists call it the Bactria-Margiana complex. Its center was along two rivers, the Murghab and the Tejon. They come down from the Pamir Mountains. About 4,000 years ago, this wasn't empty land. It was a place of fortified centers with very high walls. Inside, craftsmen made intricate seals and amulets. Stone and metal, their work shows they were connected to far-off trade, but they were also completely unique. They didn't build sprawling cities. They built these powerful, self-contained citadels. Like Ghaggar-Hakra rising from the flat plain, they were oases of order in a landscape that demanded constant watch. Their whole existence was a balance. A gift from the mountain snowmelt that fed their rivers, and then the gift stopped. The evidence is in the soil, in the abandoned streets. It points to a familiar cause. A great drying, the same period of aridification, the one that strained the Indus and shattered Akkad, the 4.2 Kiloyear event. It reached here too. The glaciers in the Pamirs may have retreated. The snowpack that fed the rivers shrank. The lifelines began to change. The flows became less reliable. Maybe they shifted course across the alluvial fans, or just diminished year by year. The sophisticated irrigation networks stretching out from the citadels would have started to fail. Canals that once buzzed with life fell silent, filling with wind-blown sand. You can see the crisis in the archaeology. The great centers weren't burned. They were carefully closed, doorways were sealed up, valuable items were placed in ritual deposits, like they hoped for a return, and then the people left. They walked away from their high walls and workshops. The population likely fragmented, went back to a more mobile, pastoral life, the kind that had always existed on the fringes. The brilliant, concentrated experiment of the Oxus civilization dissolved, back into the landscape it came from. This story isn't as famous as the pyramids or the ziggurats, but it might be one of the clearest examples of the pattern. A civilization that came together because of a river and vanished when that river couldn't sustain its ambition anymore. It shows a haunting truth. This wasn't a series of isolated tragedies. It was a global climatic shock, testing river-dependent societies from the Nile to the Indus. And now, deep in Central Asia, along the vanishing waters of the Murghab, their forgotten citadels stand as silent testimony to a world that flourished, and then adapted when its foundation simply flowed away. The great citadels of the Oxus didn't just fall empty, they were taken back into the land's own slow rhythm. That rhythm has a name in history, the longue durée. It's French for the long duration. It asks you to look past the surface events, the battles, the coronations, the textbook dates, and see the deeper currents. The ones that truly shape things. The behavior of a river is maybe the clearest example. Civilizations, dynasties, they work on a human scale. They rise, they flourish, they fall over centuries. But the forces that decide a river's path, its volume, whether it's even there, they work on a different clock, a millennial one, the slow rise of a mountain range. The shift of monsoon tracks over 1,000 years, the silt that takes 500 years to fill a port, these are the real architects. They move with a patience that makes the longest empire seem brief. From this height, the story shifts. The empire of Akkad wasn't permanent. It was a brief, brilliant episode, a chapter that could only be written during a specific window in the Near East's climate. The Maya cities, Tikal and Calakmul, they weren't eternal. They were experiments in urban life made possible by a reliable rainfall pattern that lasted centuries. Their collapses weren't just political failures. They were the moment the long-term environmental conditions that created them finally changed. The window closed. This reframing isn't to diminish what people did. It's to contextualize it, to put our stories inside a much larger, older narrative, the story of the Earth itself. The pyramids of Giza are awe-inspiring, but the Nile that fed the builders is the product of millions of years. Continental drift, climate cycles. The Great Wall of China is a monument to human will, but it was built in response to pressures shaped by the Yellow River. A volatile, silt-driven history written over millennia. There's a humility in this view. It suggests human history isn't a separate saga, a march of progress apart from nature. It's a subplot, a compelling, dramatic, often tragic subplot, woven into the planet's own epic biography. Our fortunes have always risen and fallen with the deeper currents. Water, rock, air. The river doesn't care about kings or treaties. It follows the land's gradient, the logic of physics, the dictates of a global climate. We build our worlds within what it allows, and that leads to a final question. If the fate of past societies was tied to these long-term cycles, where does our own global civilization stand within them now? We've built on an unprecedented scale with technologies the ancients couldn't imagine. But have we escaped the longue durée, or have we just entered a new, more complex chapter of the same ancient story? The story of the river and the city, it's not over, it's just moved. These megacities now, they're the inheritors of those old gambles with water, and the stakes are higher than ever. Take Bangkok, a city of 10 million people, built on the soft clay of the Chao Phraya Delta. Its skyscrapers are sinking, inch by inch, because they're pumping so much groundwater out from underneath them just to supply the city. Drawing life from the earth, and that very act compacts the ground, makes it subside. Then you add rising sea levels, and you get this slow-motion flood. A battle against the city's own foundation. It's not a natural disaster waiting. It's a geological consequence, a direct result of urban demand, or Jakarta. One of the fastest sinking cities on Earth, the Ciliwung River there is choked, polluted. Decades of pulling groundwater, unchecked, have caused such bad subsidence that 40% of the city is below sea level now. They build massive seawalls, but it's a temporary defense, a losing war. The city is drowning, literally, in the gap between its need for water and the stability of the land it's built on. It's a textbook case. A society reshapes its water environment and then is threatened by the new reality it created. Then there's the river itself, cut off from its own life. The Colorado River, lifeline for 40 million people, for huge farmlands in the U.S., Southwest and Mexico. It's a shadow now, a whole web of dams and canals, a triumph of engineering from the last century, captures every drop. That water is allocated, divided, sent hundreds of miles to fill swimming pools in Phoenix, to irrigate alfalfa in the desert. The river's natural function, to flow to the sea, to feed its delta, to complete its cycle that's been broken. It almost never reaches the Gulf of California anymore. The delta, once lush, is a dry, cracked plain now, an ecosystem starved by human need. Communities that depended on that last stretch of river have faced real hardship. Here the crisis isn't abandonment, it's allocation. A modern society living on borrowed water, watching the source of its prosperity disappear. These aren't isolated stories. They're variations. The oldest theme, the groundwater pumping in Bangkok and Jakarta, that's our version of the overextended canal. The dams on the Colorado starving its delta, that mirrors the silt-trapping reservoirs of Angkor. The rising seas threatening New Orleans and Shanghai, that's a new force, a global-scale force acting on the delicate balance of river deltas, like the shifting monsoons of the past. The technology changed, but the underlying equation is the same. Human demand versus a river system's natural capacity. We're not observers of this pattern anymore. We're participants writing the next chapters in real time, studying Mohenjo-Daro's silent streets or the salinized fields of Sumer. That's not just archaeology now. It's a field guide, a guide to the long-term consequences of breaking a river's rhythm. It shows collapse is rarely one event. It's a cascade. Ecological strain leads to economic stress, leads to social fracture. Our modern world, for all its connections and engineering, isn't immune to that cascade. Our scale might make the consequences even more profound. That's the urgent thing about the dust-covered past. It tells us the true test of a civilization isn't how grandly it builds in times of plenty. It's how wisely it manages its relationship with the foundational sources of its life. The river's lesson, whispered for thousands of years, it's a shout now, one we can't afford to ignore. Our fate, like the pharaohs and the Khmer kings, is still being written by the water. A river isn't a stage, it's a player. From the Indus to the Nile, from the Yellow River to the lost rivers of Angkor, a pattern emerges. These waterways weren't just a setting. They were active, they were powerful agents. Their floods brought a chance for abundance, but their droughts were a brutal constraint. Their shifting courses redrew maps. Trade routes power, they redrew it all. That instability, it demanded things. It demanded bureaucracy. It demanded engineering. It demanded the state itself. These were non-human actors with real historical weight. This doesn't erase human genius or human folly. It just puts it in the real arena. Human agency, the decision to build a canal, to centralize power, to fight over a fertile plain, that was always a response. A response to what the water offered and what it limited. The pharaoh's authority was a partnership with the Nile's predictability. The Chinese emperor's mandate was a struggle against the Yellow River's chaos. The choices were human, but the menu was written by the river. Political borders, so many ancient frontiers were just the reach of a canal network from a capital, or the line between land you could irrigate and desert. Economic systems came from this. Egypt's grain tax, the trade from river ports, the wealth that built temples, it all came from the river's gift. Technology too, the Shaduf, the Kanat, the massive Barre reservoirs, they were driven by a need to converse with the water, to plead with it, to coax it, to command it. Even our beliefs were shaped. A predictable river inspired a cosmology of cycles, of benevolent order. A volatile, punishing river gave rise to capricious gods. It gave rise to heroes of control. The spiritual landscape reflected the hydrological one. So civilization's story isn't a separate human saga. It's the story of a partnership. A dynamic, often tense partnership with the planet's water. A partnership that's been in constant flux since the first farmer settled on a bank. We moved from being subjects of the river's whims to becoming its managers. And then, in many cases, its overbearing directors. Those ancient collapses, they weren't failures of spirit. They were breakdowns in that fundamental relationship. The environment changed the terms, and the societal adaptations couldn't keep pace. This reframes the past. It asks us to read history not just through treaties and battles, but through silt layers. Through oxygen isotopes, to see an empire's fall not as an ending, but as a moment when the long-term rhythms of Earth finally overwhelmed the shorter-term rhythms of human politics. Our ancestors lived within a conversation with their rivers, a conversation we're still having. The stakes are higher now. It's global. The water still holds the pen. The question is whether we've learned to listen to what it's trying to say. The story in the river mud is about resilience. It shows that the biggest walls, the grandest temples, the most complex systems, they're all temporary. They are attempts to put order on a world that's fluid. The river's path was never fixed. It was a conversation, a dialogue between water and land that went on for thousands of years. And the civilizations along its banks were part of that dialogue. They weren't in charge. Their genius was in listening, in adapting, in building things that worked with the water's rhythm for as long as that worked. Their tragedy came when they stopped listening, when they thought control was permanent, or when the climate changed and spoke in a language their engineering couldn't understand anymore. That history leaves us with a question, an urgent one. We're the inheritors of that same gamble now. Our global civilization is the biggest hydraulic project ever. We draw life from rivers and lakes and underground water everywhere. We have technology that would seem like magic to the builders of the past, but the basic relationship is the same. We still depend completely on freshwater systems staying stable, and those systems are changing now at a pace and a scale that feels like the great climatic shifts of the past. The difference is, this time we're not just watching the change happen, we're helping to shape it. The lesson from the silt isn't about doom, it's about paying attention. It asks us to see our cities and our farms and our borders as part of a living water system, to ask the old questions with new tools. Where does our water really come from? What long-term rhythms is it following, and what are the quiet stresses building up, the salt in the soil, the ground sinking, the rains shifting, that we might be missing? The past shows that collapse is rarely one event. It's a cascade, an environmental shift that leads to economic strain, that leads to social fracture, that invites conflict. Seeing the early steps in that cascade is our best defense. So let this be a call to build a different kind of resilience, one that remembers what rivers remember. A resilience built on flexibility, on diversification, on a humility that knows we design within nature's parameters, not over them. The silent arbiters of power are still working. They flow in the aquifers under our cities and in the atmospheric rivers above them. Our task is to hear their whispers before they become a roar, to write a new chapter in this ancient dialogue. One where adaptation and harmony replace control and conquest. The future, like the past, will be written by water. The question is what story we choose to tell with it.